They called her unworthy before she ever spoke a word. They said the throne answered only to blood, and hers was a stain. In a court built on cruelty disguised as law, she was meant to disappear quietly. But the Alpha King saw what the realm feared to name. One public choice shattered centuries of power and exposed a buried lie. As enemies closed in and the court turned vicious, destiny demanded a sacrifice. She was never meant to survive the throne. She was meant to change it forever. She lived close enough to the palace to hear the horns that announced council sessions and feast days, but far enough that she was never meant to be seen. The servants' quarters pressed up against the outer wall like an afterthought, a place built for hands, not names. She had been brought there as a child with no crest, no parents to claim her, and no pact to defend her. The court scribes had filed her existence under a practical category: useful, replaceable, quiet. The old women who worked the laundry did not know her origin, but they knew her scent carried the thin, sharp edge of an Omega-born, an identity that, in this city, was treated less like nature and more like an accusation. Over time, rumor did the work that truth refused to do. She became cursed in the mouths of people who needed a reason to despise what they could not control. They called her politically inconvenient as if she were a misplaced document. Her presence did not fit the court's tidy story of bloodlines and destiny, so they tried to press her into a smaller shape. In the corridors, she felt the way the nobles' gazes slid past her like she was air, then snapped back with sudden irritation when she did not vanish on command. When she carried trays through reception rooms, she heard her name used as a warning and a joke. Whispers followed her like a shadow, threading through laughter that never reached anyone's eyes. They spoke of impurity and failed lineage, of the shame of an Omega too close to the throne, of the risk that her very existence posed to their perfect hierarchy. Some insisted she was proof that the palace walls had cracks. Others claimed she was a deliberate insult placed there by fate itself. Public scorn did not always come loudly. Sometimes it arrived as an extra step someone forced her to take so she would have to squeeze past, shoulders turned, head lowered. Sometimes it arrived as a cup placed just out of reach, a command given too quickly so failure felt inevitable. The most skilled cruelty was the kind dressed as procedure, the kind that could not be punished because it wore the uniform of propriety. She learned to count her breaths and keep her face calm. She learned to move with careful precision, as if any sudden motion might be interpreted as defiance. When she was spoken to, it was rarely as a person. It was as a task, a tool, a problem to be managed. Yet beneath the weight of their contempt, something stubborn remained in her. It was not confidence, not at first, and certainly not hope. It was a quiet dignity shaped by survival, a refusal to collapse in front of people who expected her to beg for the smallest mercy. Her shame lived deep, rooted in the years she had spent absorbing their verdicts, but it did not own her completely. She carried it the way one carried an old wound, carefully, silently, pretending it did not ache until the night made pretending harder. In the darkest hours, she reminded herself that ambition was dangerous. Wanting more invited attention, and attention invited punishment. If she could stay useful, stay unnoticed, stay alive, then maybe she could keep her heart intact. Survival, in her mind, was not cowardice. It was strategy. The palace itself seemed to agree with the court's judgment of her. The grand halls were built for alphas with broad shoulders and louder voices, for heirs who moved through the world like it belonged to them. The stone floors echoed beneath noble boots, while her softer steps were swallowed. Even the scent of the place felt selective, spice and smoke and wealth, layers of dominance laid down over generations like a permanent declaration. She felt it pressing against her in every doorway. She was a guest in a world that insisted she was trespassing. Then the air began to change. It happened first in the way guards sharpened the discipline, in the way council messengers hurried as if the walls had started listening. A name returned to conversation like a storm cloud rolling back over familiar ground. The Alpha King was coming back to the capital, the war-forged ruler who had spent years forcing rebellious borders into uneasy peace. People spoke of him with a careful mixture of reverence and dread. They called him merciless because mercy had never won a battle, and they praised him for the same reason they feared him: he did not bend. It was said he valued loyalty more than blood, yet the ones who told that story always sounded as if they were trying to convince themselves. Her world tightened around that approaching return. The nobles polished the public faces and sharpened the private knives. The servants received new rules, new inspections, new warnings about what would happen if anyone embarrassed the court during the king's first days home. For her, it meant the smallest mistakes felt heavier, the smallest stares felt sharper. She told herself that his arrival changed nothing. He would not see her, would not care, would not spare a thought for an Omega-born servant woven into the background of palace life. Still, something uneasy stirred in her chest, a sense that the realm's attention was turning like a wolf's head catching an unfamiliar scent. The announcement came at dusk, carried on the horns that echoed over rooftops and into alleyways. The conclave would be held publicly, the old gathering where succession pressures were aired and mating alliances were examined like contracts. It was the season for decisions, for formal bonds, for declarations that shaped the realm's next decade. The city seemed to inhale at once. Some households celebrated, already counting the political gains they expected to harvest. Others went quiet, knowing the conclave had a way of turning whispers into public verdicts. For the court, it was theater. For everyone else, it was fate made official. She heard of it in the servants' hall, where the news arrived like a thrown stone. A scribe's runner had posted the preliminary registry near the kitchen's apartment list that named those called to appear, those whose presence would be judged, those who would be measured against the realm's brutal standards. The staff gathered in tight clusters, reading and rereading names with the hungry curiosity of people who survived on second-hand power. She stayed at the edge at first, hands damp, telling herself there was no reason to look. Her name would not be there. She belonged to the margins, not the registry. But the crowd shifted, and the parchment became visible between shoulders. Her eyes found the list without permission, scanning lines that held noble crests and known heirs, familiar predators dressed in silk. Then, halfway down, her breath caught. Among names that had no right to share space with hers, her own appeared in ink that did not tremble. It sat there calmly, as if it had always belonged, as if the realm had already decided to drag her into the light. And in that moment, she understood the most frightening truth of all: survival was no longer fully her choice. The Alpha King returned to the capital the way winter returned to the mountains, inevitable, uncompromising, and felt long before he was seen. His arrival did not need celebration to be understood. The gates opened wider, the guards' backs straightened, and even the nobles who loved their own power more than the crown remembered to lower their voices. He rode through the city without spectacle, yet the streets still emptied as if the stone itself had been warned. He was not young in the way the court preferred its symbols, but he was not old either. He carried the kind of age that came from responsibility rather than years, an authority carved into him by decisions that could not be undone. War had shaped him first. Betrayal had shaped him second. The realm's outer territories had burned with rebellion when he was still learning the weight of command, and he had learned quickly that treaties were only as strong as the fear behind them. The final betrayal had not come from an enemy pack but from within his own circle, a trusted voice that had guided him toward a trap disguised as diplomacy. He survived it, but survival left marks that did not fade. He no longer treated promises as protection. He treated them as tools. In the palace, some called him ruthless because they needed to believe cruelty was the reason he could not be controlled. Others called him destined because they needed to believe his power had a story that made it less terrifying. The story that mattered to him had never been spoken aloud in court. It lived in the fragments of prophecy that the old seers delivered in riddles, warning of a bond that could either stabilize the realm or split it beyond repair. The Alpha King had heard those warnings when he was younger and still tempted to laugh at mystics. He did not laugh anymore. He had seen too many, impossible, things happen on the battlefield to dismiss the unseen. He had learned that the future did not always announce itself like a trumpet. Sometimes it arrived like a quiet turn in the air, a subtle shift that only the alert survived. What separated him from the rest of the court was not simply strength. It was perception. Most wolves trusted scent above all else. Scent confirmed hierarchy, intention, and emotion. It made the world readable. But the Alpha King had developed an awareness that did not rely on the obvious. In war, scent could be masked. In politics, it could be faked. He had trained himself to listen for what stayed true beneath performance, the steadiness of breath when fear should have shaken it, the way a gaze held or broke, the small pauses that revealed what a person did not want to say. He felt bonds not as romance or myth but as a pressure in the space between people, an invisible alignment that could not be manufactured. The conclave began with ceremonies designed to remind the realm who had always controlled the story. Noble houses arrived draped in their colors, parading their heirs like offerings. The hall filled with a calculated mix of incense and dominance, meant to overwhelm anyone who entered without privilege. The Alpha King sat above it all on the raised platform, the throne behind him an old symbol that no longer needed embellishment. He watched the procession with an expression that gave nothing away. The nobles did not know what unsettled them more, his silence or the sense that he was measuring them rather than welcoming them. She was not meant to be part of the early ceremonies. She was meant to be a shadow at the edge, a servant assigned to pour and clear and retreat. Yet the registry had placed her among those required to appear, and the command was absolute. When the first formal rites began, she stood where she had been instructed, near the outer line of participants, surrounded by people who wore wealth like armor. She did not match the scene, and they made sure she felt it. A pair of noble women glanced at her and smiled the way predators smiled at prey they had already decided to toy with. A lord muttered something to his companion, and quiet laughter followed, the kind meant to be heard but never acknowledged. Humiliation in this hall was an art. It was performed with elegance, delivered in gestures too refined to be punished. A ceremonial attendant, accidentally, directed her to the wrong position so she would have to correct herself publicly. A young alpha heir brushed past her shoulder with deliberate force, just enough to make her stumble, not enough to be called an attack. The court watched, waiting for her to react, waiting for her to prove their assumptions by shrinking or snapping. She did neither. She steadied herself, adjusted her stance, and lowered her eyes with controlled calm. Her face remained composed, her breathing measured. It was not submission that held her together. It was discipline. She looked like someone who had endured worse than this and refused to offer the crowd the satisfaction of seeing it hurt. That was when the Alpha King noticed her. It was not her scent that drew him. In truth, her scent was muted under the heavy dominance layered through the hall. It was not her appearance either, because the court held too many polished beauties for any single one to stand out. It was the absence of performance around her. While everyone else shaped themselves for attention, she seemed focused on something deeper, staying anchored. Her composure under calculated cruelty cut through the noise like a clean blade through cloth. The nobles continued their mockery, encouraged by the belief that the king would not intervene. They had long relied on his distance. If he did not speak, they assumed he agreed. But his silence that day was different. It was not indifference. It was attention sharpened into stillness. The people closest to the throne began to feel it first, the way one felt a storm change direction. Laughter dimmed, conversation stumbled. A few elders glanced upward and then quickly away, as if the Alpha King's gaze carried consequences. Inside him, a conflict stirred that he did not welcome. Duty demanded he treat the conclave as a controlled mechanism, a place where alliances could be formed cleanly. The realm was fragile. Every choice he made became precedent. Every preference became a weapon others would try to use against him. He should have viewed her as a complication and dismissed her as irrelevant. Yet the pull he felt was not desire, not yet, but recognition. Something in him insisted she mattered to the structure of what was coming. It was the same instinct that had saved him on battlefields, the same warning that had kept him alive when others trusted tradition and died for it. His advisors noticed the shift before he acknowledged it. They leaned in with careful urgency, reminding him that the court was watching, that the great houses were already restless, that any sign of favor toward an Omega-born outcast could be interpreted as weakness or provocation. One warned him that her presence on the registry was likely a trap set by rivals, a way to lure him into scandal. Another implied that the old bloodline laws existed for stability, and stability was the one thing he could not risk. He heard them, he understood them, he also understood the dangerous truth they would not say aloud. The realm's stability was already an illusion, and illusions broke when tested. As the ceremony progressed, the hall's tension thickened. The nobles' confidence wavered, unsure whether to continue their sport or retreat. She remained still, bearing the weight of the room like someone carrying a hidden burden. The Alpha King watched her through the shifting bodies, through the banners, through the ritual smoke. The pressure in his chest grew sharper, not painful, but insistent, like a command that came from someplace older than his crown. Then, without raising his voice, he made a decision that changed the room's temperature. He signaled to the ceremonial marshal, and the marshal froze, startled by being noticed at all. The Alpha King's gaze remained fixed forward as he issued a simple instruction, formal enough to be unquestionable. He ordered her to step forward and stand closer to the throne. The hall went silent in a way that did not feel like respect. It felt like shock, and as she lifted her eyes, uncertain whether she had heard correctly, every noble in the room understood the same thing at once. The Alpha King had seen her, and whatever came next would not be controlled by tradition. The trial of worth was older than the throne itself, older than the banners that now pretended to unify the realm. It belonged to an era when packs had been smaller and the wild had still pressed close to the edges of civilization, when leadership was decided less by ceremony and more by what a wolf could endure. Over generations, the trial had been refined into something the nobles could control, wrapped in sacred language and polished stone, but its purpose remained brutally simple. It exposed what blood carried, what spirit could bear, and what dominance could hold without breaking. They led the participants into the Hall of Verdicts at dawn, when the sky outside the high windows was pale and the air inside the chamber felt cold enough to bite. The room was circular, designed so no one could hide in corners. Pillars carved with ancient runes rose like watchful sentinels, their markings said to record every oath ever sworn beneath them. At the center sat the trial dais, a raised platform of dark stone, ringed by a thin groove where old blood once collected in centuries past. In modern times, they did not speak of that history too loudly. They preferred to call the groove symbolic. They preferred the trial to feel dignified. The ritual began with the lighting of braziers around the circle, each flame carrying herbs meant to strip away deception. The scent was sharp and metallic, curling in the throat. Elders in ceremonial cloaks moved in precise patterns, chanting words that sounded less like language and more like a pulse. The trial was not solely physical. It was spiritual and magical, designed to bring hidden traits to the surface. It tested bloodline strength by measuring a wolf's ability to withstand pressure without submitting. It tested magic compatibility by forcing the body's sealed energies to respond to the runes etched into the dais. It tested dominance by drawing out instinct and seeing whether it could be tempered into control. For nobles, the trial was a showcase. It was a stage where power could be displayed and celebrated, where the right lineage could prove itself again and again. For someone like her, it was a blade held politely at the throat. She stood among the others in the outer ring, wearing simple clothing that marked her as neither house-born nor protected. Her presence in the hall looked like a mistake the court had refused to correct. She felt the attention immediately. It was not curiosity, it was impatience. Most of them had already decided what she was: an inconvenience, an embarrassment, an omega too close to sacred things. If the trial destroyed her, they would call it justice. If it spared her, they would call it corruption. The nobles who wanted her gone did not leave her fate to chance. They never did. Before the elders began, whispered instructions passed through the council benches like threads being pulled tight. A ceremonial attendant adjusted one of the runic stones near the dais, claiming it had shifted from age. Another elder, one aligned with the old bloodlines, corrected a sequence in the chant with an innocent tone that hid intent. Small changes, almost invisible to anyone who did not know the trial intimately, but enough to tilt its outcome. The trial was supposed to reveal truth. In the hands of politics, truth became something arranged. She understood none of the mechanics, but she understood the atmosphere. She recognized the sharp eagerness beneath the calm faces. She saw the way certain nobles watched her with the satisfaction of people who had already purchased the ending. Her stomach tightened, yet she did not plead. In her mind, disgrace was inevitable. The court had pulled her into the conclave not to offer her possibility, but to make an example of her in front of everyone. If she had any control at all, it would be over how she carried herself while they took the rest. When her name was called, it sounded wrong in that hall, as if the chamber rejected it. A low murmur ran through the benches, then quieted into a strained silence. She stepped forward onto the inner circle. The air grew heavier, a pressure settling over her shoulders. She could feel dominance in the room gathering like a tide. Her omega-born instincts wanted to shrink, to retreat, to become small enough not to be crushed. She forced her breath steady and moved onto the dais. The stone beneath her feet was cold, but the runes etched into it seemed to hum faintly, as though the surface held a heartbeat. She stood where she was instructed, spine straight, chin level, eyes lowered not in submission but in discipline. She told herself she was only here to endure, to maintain dignity until they dismissed her. She told herself not to hope for rescue. Hope was a weapon that turned inward when it failed. The elders began the chant, and the hall sound changed. The braziers flared, their flames leaning inward as if drawn toward her. The runes on the pillars brightened faintly, responding to the ritual's rhythm. At first, everything followed the expected pattern. The pressure built in careful increments, like hands tightening around her chest. She felt it test her boundaries, searching for places she would collapse. She focused on breathing through it, letting the discomfort move through her instead of owning her. The crowd watched, waiting for the moment she broke. Then the dais reacted. It was subtle at first, a pulse that traveled through the stone into her soles, up her legs, into her ribs. Her skin prickled as if the air had turned charged. The runes beneath her feet began to glow, not with the controlled steady light the nobles were accustomed to, but with a shifting brightness that looked almost alive. The elders faltered, their voices wavering for a breath, then pushed on harder, as if force could restore order. Her heartbeat stumbled. She felt something inside her respond, something sealed and dormant, something she had never had a name for because it had never been allowed to exist. Heat spread under her skin, not feverish but powerful, like waking embers. Her senses sharpened abruptly. The hall's scents layered into clarity: incense, iron, old stone, fear disguised as perfume. She could hear the fine scrape of fabric when nobles shifted, could hear the quiet shock in their breathing. She could feel the dominance pressing from all directions, and instead of crushing her, it triggered a response. The energy surged again, stronger, and this time the groove around the dais lit as if filled with liquid light. A gasp broke from somewhere in the benches. The elder's chant turned frantic, voices rising to regain control, but the trial no longer sounded like theirs alone. It sounded like something answering her. Her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness but from confusion. She did not understand what was happening. She had never trained in magic, never learned the language of runes, never been told her body could hold anything other than survival. Yet the dais was reacting to her as if it recognized her, as if it had been waiting. The noble's manipulation backfired. The altered runes, meant to magnify her failure, instead magnified the awakening. The pressure that should have forced submission turned unstable, whipping through the chamber in invisible waves. The brazier's flames shot higher, their smoke swirling violently. One of the elders stepped back, face pale, as the runes on his cloak flickered as if trying to peel away. Panic did not erupt openly, because this was the court and they were trained to mask fear, but the room changed. The spectators leaned forward, eyes wide. Some looked thrilled, others looked horrified. A few, the most politically cautious, looked as if they had already started rewriting alliances in their heads. The law was clear. If the trial became corrupted or dangerous, the subject could be deemed a threat and executed to protect the realm. That rule had been used before, usually against inconvenient challenges, always justified as necessity. She felt the shift in intent as if it had weight. The elder's eyes flicked toward the council benches, seeking permission without words. The nobles who hated her leaned in, ready to seize the opportunity. The Alpha King did not rise. He did not shout. He did not give the court a dramatic display they could twist into scandal. He simply moved his hand, a controlled gesture that looked like nothing to the untrained eye. But the marshal standing near the dais stiffened and adjusted position, subtly blocking a direct line between the execution blade and the platform. At the same time, the Alpha King spoke one quiet sentence to the elder nearest him, and the elder's expression tightened with reluctant obedience. The chant shifted, not stopped, but redirected. The rhythm changed just enough to stabilize the most dangerous surge, lowering the ritual's intensity without appearing to interfere. It was skill wrapped in restraint. The trial's glow did not vanish, but it steadied, the runaway energy settling into a pulsing light that clung to her like a second skin. She stood frozen, breath shallow, eyes wide now because she could not pretend she was invisible anymore. She had been revealed, not in the way they intended, but in a way that made the room feel suddenly smaller. The power inside her did not feel malicious. It felt old. It felt contained only because something had been containing it for years. As the ritual concluded, the elders moved into the final sequence meant to deliver a verdict. Usually the trial declared one of three outcomes: worthy, unworthy, or condemned. The hall waited, tense, hungry for the clarity of a label. The elder who held the ceremonial staff raised it, voice shaking slightly as he spoke the concluding words. The runes on the dais flared once more, then dimmed to a glow that hovered between certainty and refusal. The staff's stone tip did not change color. The groove around the platform did not darken. The symbols on the pillars did not settle into the familiar pattern. The elder blinked, then spoke again, louder, as if volume could force compliance. The hall remained suspended, the ritual refusing to complete itself. Whispers surged in the benches. People leaned toward one another, trading frantic interpretations. Some insisted the trial had been broken. Some said she had broken it. Others, quieter and older, looked as if they had seen a ghost. Finally, the elder lowered the staff, his face drawn tight with disbelief, and announced the only truth the trial had offered. It declared no verdict. The chamber fell into stunned silence because an outcome like that did not exist in their history. And in that silence, rumors began forming faster than anyone could stop them, taking shape around a single terrifying idea: her existence was not merely inconvenient. It was destabilizing, and as she stood on the glowing stone, unsure whether to feel fear or wonder, she realized the realm had just witnessed something it could not control, and the court would not forgive her for it. After the trial declared nothing, the palace became a vessel filled with unspoken panic. The conclave continued on paper, but its rhythm had been broken. Every corridor carried whispers that stopped the moment a guard rounded the corner. Every servant learned new routes to avoid stepping into the crossfire of noble arguments. The court pretended it was waiting for clarity, but what it truly waited for was permission to attack. A verdictless trial left too much space for fear, and fear in a realm built on dominance always demanded a target. She was ordered into a quiet wing of the palace that most staff avoided, a place where old stone held cold longer than it should and where tapestries hung like watchers. The official reason was protection. The real reason was containment. If she could not be labeled, she could at least be isolated. 2 guards remained outside her door at all times, their presence framed as honor, but their eyes never softened. Even within those walls she felt the judgment pressing in, not shouted now, but calculated. The Alpha King did not visit her immediately. He let the court believe he was watching from a distance. But distance, she learned, did not mean indifference. Late on the second night after the trial, an attendant came for her quietly and led her through a narrow passage that bypassed the main corridors. The route smelled of old dust and sealed wood, and when the attendant stopped, it was before a door without markings. Inside waited not a council, but a single elder and the Alpha King. The elder was one of the few whose age was not ornamental. His eyes were pale with time, his hands steady with the confidence of someone who had carried secrets long enough that they had become a second spine. On the table beside him lay a stack of thin, worn books bound in cracked leather. Their pages were browned, ink faded, and yet the air around them felt sharp, as if the records themselves resisted being disturbed. Forbidden records were not forbidden because they were false. They were forbidden because they were true in ways the realm could not afford. The elder did not waste kindness or cruelty. He spoke as if giving testimony, not comfort. He explained that the trial's failure to declare a verdict was itself a message. The ritual had not malfunctioned. It had recognized something it was not designed to categorize. He slid one book toward her, then another, opening them to pages marked with brittle ribbons. Names filled the lines in careful script. Crests were drawn beside them, some now erased from public archives, some still honored in council halls. Her eyes moved across the pages without understanding at first. The language of nobility was a language of distance, and she had lived her life in the margins where such script was never meant to reach her. Then she saw symbols that matched the carvings she had seen on the trial pillars. She saw a crest repeated in older ink, a crest she recognized because it had been scraped off certain statues in the palace, an absence that servants noticed even when they were told not to look. The elder's voice remained steady as he delivered the first truth. Her bloodline had not been an accident. It had been a threat. Generations ago, before the current royal line secured unquestioned dominance, there had been a rival branch within the ruling blood. Not rebellious, not treasonous, but legitimate enough to split allegiance. That branch carried a different kind of power, a blend of magic and instinct that did not align neatly with the court's preferred hierarchy. When a succession crisis threatened to ignite civil war, the winning faction did not simply defeat their rivals. They erased them, they rewrote archives, they ordered silent purges disguised as plague and exile. And for the survivors who could not be killed without drawing suspicion, they created something worse than death. They suppressed the bloodline. Her throat tightened as the elder turned another page, revealing a list of names followed by a single repeated notation. Sealed, hidden, bound. The words felt unreal, like a story told to frighten children. Yet the elder spoke of it with the calm of a man describing weather. He explained that a sealing curse had been crafted to prevent the rival line's power from surfacing. Not to weaken it permanently, but to delay it until the bloodline became harmless through time, diluted and forgotten. The curse was strategic. It was patience weaponized. She stared at the ink until the lines blurred. Her mind fought the truth because accepting it meant accepting everything else that followed. It meant her life had not been shaped by random cruelty. It had been engineered. Her supposed curse, the reason whispered behind her back, was not proof of impurity. It was evidence of deliberate fear. The elder's final testimony struck deeper than the rest. She had not been placed in the palace because she was convenient. She had been placed there because someone wanted to keep her close, to watch the seal, to ensure it never cracked. Even her orphan status was suspect. Records showed no birth registration in any outer pack. No trade note, no adoption agreement, just a single line, years ago, ordering her, transfer, to palace service as if she were an object. Anger rose in her like heat she could not control. It was not loud anger. It was the kind that made her vision sharpen, the kind that made her hands curl until her nails pressed crescent marks into her palms. Grief followed right behind it, heavy and sour. She had mourned parents she could not name and a childhood that never felt safe, believing misfortune was simply her fate. Now she saw the lie beneath it. They had stolen her origin and called it order. They had fed her shame and called it truth. Disbelief fought for dominance inside her. She wanted to reject it all, to insist the elder was mistaken or manipulating her, because the alternative was unbearable. Yet her body still remembered the trial's glow. Her skin still carried echoes of power that had answered the stone like a forgotten language suddenly spoken again. The evidence was not just ink on pages. It was inside her. The Alpha King had remained silent through most of the testimony, his expression carved into control. But when the elder spoke the name of the curse, an old phrasing that sounded like a prayer and a threat combined, the king's focus sharpened. His gaze fixed on the elder with a weight that made the air in the room feel tighter. He recognized the signature. The curse was not just any seal. Its pattern matched the markings he had seen years ago in a prophecy fragment delivered by a dying seer on the battlefield. At the time, he had dismissed it as the delirium of a wounded mystic. The seer had spoken of a hidden bloodline, of a power delayed by intentional binding, of a ruler who would be tested not by war but by choice. The words had stayed with him, not because he trusted prophecy, but because he trusted patterns, and the pattern had never left his mind. Now it stood in front of him, breathing, wounded by a life built on lies, and dangerous precisely because she did not yet understand what she carried. The room shifted from revelation to strategy. The Alpha King asked short questions. The elder answered carefully. The curse, they concluded, had been designed to break under specific conditions, an alignment of place, ritual, and proximity to authority. The trial of worth had likely been one of those triggers. Someone, intentionally or recklessly, had moved her into the conclave at the exact moment the seal was most vulnerable. Which meant someone wanted this awakening. And if someone wanted it, others would move to destroy it before it changed the realm. That truth proved itself before dawn. Beyond the sealed wing, the palace began to stir with unnatural activity. Guards changed shifts twice in half an hour. Servants were redirected away from certain corridors. The Alpha King's advisors arrived with tense faces and urgent murmurs about council meetings held without permission, about noble houses sending messages to their territories, about quiet pledges being traded like coins. Factions were mobilizing. Some feared she would challenge the bloodline order. Some feared the Alpha King would claim her as leverage. Others feared the prophecy itself and wanted her dead simply to keep the future predictable. She stood near the table, still staring at the forbidden names, when a distant sound reached the room, a faint scrape against stone, too subtle for most ears, but sharp enough in the silence to register. The Alpha King's posture changed instantly. His attention turned toward the door with a predator's focus. The elder went still, then another sound followed, closer this time. A soft click that did not belong to the palace's ordinary rhythm. The Alpha King moved to the side with controlled speed, positioning himself where he could see the entry without appearing alarmed. He did not draw attention. He did not create panic. He simply reached toward a concealed mechanism in the wall, a signal that summoned silent guards without ringing bells. A moment later, the air itself seemed to split with tension. A shadow passed under the doorframe, thin and deliberate. The scent that followed was wrong, masked, sharpened with bitter herbs meant to confuse tracking. She felt her heart drop into her stomach as realization formed faster than thought. This was not rumor anymore. This was not politics confined to council benches. Someone had moved past law and ceremony into intent. The door handle shifted slightly, as if tested by someone patient enough to wait for the right second. And in the breath before it opened, she understood that the truth about her bloodline was not merely history. It was a death sentence others were ready to enforce. The attempt on her life did not become a public scandal, not immediately. The palace had too much practice at swallowing danger before it could become rumor. The Alpha King's guards intercepted the intruder in the corridor outside the sealed wing, and what followed was handled with the kind of quiet efficiency that left no spectacle behind. By sunrise, the passage had been scrubbed clean, the servants reassigned, and the official narrative prepared. If anyone asked, it had been a drunken trespasser. If anyone insisted on details, the response was a cold reminder that the king's security was not a subject for curiosity. But the court was not fooled. They rarely needed evidence, they needed only scent in the air, the tension in a guard's shoulders, the abrupt tightening of protocol. Something had happened, and because it involved her, the court treated it as confirmation of what they already believed. Her presence was a destabilizing force. When the council assembled that morning, the Hall of Dominion filled with controlled outrage. The elders sat like carved stone, but their eyes flashed with the hunger of people who sensed opportunity. The great houses positioned themselves with careful intention, allies clustered close, rivals spaced apart, each faction measuring the others for weakness. They did not openly accuse one another of the assassination attempt. That would have forced honesty none of them wanted. Instead they argued about consequences, and in their language, consequences always meant her. They demanded stability. They demanded the realm be protected from unpredictable power. They demanded the Alpha King demonstrate that tradition still held authority over his reign. The words were polished, but the message beneath them was raw: remove her or be removed. Some called for public condemnation, insisting her verdictless trial proved corruption and danger. Others called for exile to the borderlands, where the realm's problems were sent to be forgotten. A few suggested a sanctuary confinement, a gentler phrase for imprisonment beneath sacred oversight. Every option was designed to strip her of agency and reassure the court that hierarchy remained intact. The Alpha King listened without interruption. His silence unsettled them more than an argument would have. When he finally spoke, he did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He did not plead. He simply asked one question, clean and sharp as steel. Who, exactly, benefited from making her the enemy? The council's outrage hesitated, not because they had an answer, but because the question shifted the room's balance. It forced him to acknowledge what they preferred to keep in shadow. Someone had placed her on the conclave registry, someone had manipulated the trial, someone had moved to kill her once the truth surfaced. The court wanted to pretend she was the cause. The Alpha King's question reminded them she might be the target. Still, they pressed. They spoke of prophecy as if it was superstition, even while fearing it. They spoke of old bloodlines as if they were sacred, even while using them as shields. They warned him that the realm was watching and that doubt spread faster than war. One elder, emboldened by his faction's support, suggested that an Alpha King who could not control a single Omega-born servant had no right to control the realm. That insult was calculated. It was meant to provoke him into anger so they could label his response tyranny. The Alpha King did not give them that satisfaction. He let the insult hang in the air until it started to rot with its own arrogance. Then he delivered his decision. He invoked an archaic mercy law that had not been used in generations, a decree rooted in the oldest code of the realm. It allowed the reigning monarch to claim protective authority over an accused individual when the court's judgment was compromised by conflict of interest. It was a law designed for rare moments when politics threatened to replace justice, when the crown needed to reassert control over a court that had forgotten its place. The room's reaction was immediate. Some nobles flinched as if struck. Others erupted, voices rising in outrage that they could not fully mask. They protested that the law was obsolete, that its use would be seen as weakness, that it would invite rebellion from pacts already uneasy about the conclave's instability. The elders argued that mercy was not meant for threats, and that the king was endangering the realm by protecting her. The Alpha King did not retreat. He announced the decree formally, sealing it with his authority in front of witnesses. She would remain under royal protection. Any attempt to harm her would be treated as an attack on the crown itself. The words were simple, but their implication was explosive. He was tying his reign to her survival. Backlash spread through the capital like smoke. Council members stormed from the hall, sending urgent messages to their territories. Noble houses held private gatherings that ran late into the night, where alliances were rewritten and threats sharpened into plans. Some pacts interpreted the decree as proof the Alpha King had been compromised by an Omega-born influence. Others saw it as an opportunity to challenge him, believing public unrest could weaken the throne enough for a rival claim. In the streets, rumors twisted the decree into scandal, painting her as a manipulator who had ensnared the king with forbidden magic. People who had never seen her face spoke her name with anger, because anger was easier than uncertainty. She heard enough of it to feel sick. From the protected wing, she watched the palace's mood shift toward hostility. Servants avoided her gaze. Guards moved with heightened caution. The air carried the tension of a storm that could not decide where to strike. For years, she had survived by being small, by staying out of the court's direct line of fire. Now, the king's decree had placed her at the center of it. Guilt settled over her in layers. She told herself she had not asked for this. She told herself she had not engineered the trial, had not forged the curse, had not chosen to be born into a suppressed bloodline. None of that stopped the crushing sense that her existence was tearing the realm open. Every time she heard distant arguments, every time she saw a messenger rush past with sealed letters, she felt as if she were personally responsible for the chaos. She began thinking in the language of escape again. If she disappeared, perhaps the pressure would ease. If she left the palace, perhaps the Alpha King could restore stability. If she offered herself to exile, perhaps the court would quiet down. Survival had always been her only promise to herself, and survival often meant leaving before the wolves decided to hunt. That was when the Alpha King came to see her. He entered without ceremony, dismissing the guards with a brief gesture. The room felt smaller with him in it, not because he tried to dominate the space, but because his presence carried authority that did not require display. He studied her the way he studied a battlefield, taking in posture, breath, the subtle tension in her shoulders. He did not ask if she was afraid. He already knew. She tried to speak first, to offer herself as the solution, to suggest she could leave. The words came out controlled, but her eyes betrayed the strain beneath them. She told him she did not want to be the reason pacts turned against him. She told him she had never wanted power. She told him she could survive anywhere as long as she was not a burden. The Alpha King let her finish. Then he stepped closer, not in intimacy, but in confrontation. His voice remained low, but it carried the firmness of a command that refused negotiation. He told her survival was no longer her only role. He told her that the realm's instability was not caused by her existence but by the court's obsession with controlling it. He told her that if she ran now, she would confirm every lie they had spread about her weakness. And he told her something else, something sharper and more dangerous than comfort. The power that had awakened in the trial was not an accident, and the realm would not stop hunting her simply because she chose exile. They would hunt her because she represented a future they could not predict. She argued that she was not prepared, that she did not even understand what she carried. He did not deny it. He said preparation could be taught, understanding could be earned, but choice, he insisted, had to be claimed. If she surrendered her place now, the court would write her story the same way it had written her life, as a footnote, as a warning, as an object to be managed. Their bond, whatever it was becoming, deepened in that moment not through tenderness, but through shared defiance. He was not offering romance. He was offering a position beside danger. He was forcing her to see herself not as a problem to be removed, but as a person whose presence mattered enough to threaten the world. The air between them tightened with the weight of what he had done for her, and what he was now demanding she do for herself. She did not know how to accept protection without feeling trapped. She did not know how to hold power without fearing it. Yet she understood one truth with growing clarity: if she kept trying to shrink, the realm would crush her anyway. Before he left, the Alpha King delivered the final warning, his tone controlled but edged with urgency. The council, furious and humiliated, would not let his mercy stand without forcing a public test of his authority. They would demand spectacle, because spectacle was how the court disciplined rulers it could not control. The coronation feast was approaching, a gathering meant to renew loyalty and celebrate the throne. The Alpha King said the council intended to turn it into something else. They intended to demand a final ruling on her fate in front of the entire realm. And as he walked out, leaving her alone with the echo of his decree and the roar of politics beyond the walls, she realized the palace was not preparing for a feast. It was preparing for a public execution of reputation, power, and perhaps, if the court found the right moment, her life. The coronation feast was never meant to be a celebration of joy. In the werewolf realm, feasts were instruments. They turned power into pageantry, turned fear into etiquette, and convinced the public that order was natural instead of enforced. The palace prepared for it with relentless precision. Tapestries were rehum, braziers were placed to sweeten the air, and the great hall was arranged so every seat broadcast status. The Alpha King's dais sat elevated at the far end, framed by stone pillars carved with ancestral runes, while the long tables below formed a deliberate map of influence. Those closest to the throne would be seen. Those placed farther away would be reminded of the distance. All factions arrived. Loyalists came first, wearing careful expressions and carrying gifts that looked generous but were weighed like bribes. Rival houses followed, their smiles too practiced, their entourages too large for comfort. Border pack representatives entered with stiff posture, representing regions that had fought the king's campaigns and now tolerated peace as if it were temporary. Even enemies were invited, because the realm's tradition demanded that conflict be contained under ceremony. The same wolves who plotted against one another in private were expected to drink from the same cups in public. It was how the court proved control. She was brought into the hall after most of the guests had already taken their seats. It was not kindness, it was strategy. The court wanted her to walk through a corridor of judgment. Guards flanked her, their presence framed as protection, but every noble understood it as containment. The moment she stepped into the torchlight, the room's conversations thinned and then shifted into a quieter, sharper hum. She wore clothing chosen by palace attendants under strict instruction. Nothing extravagant, nothing that could be called an attempt to claim status. Yet it was fitted well enough that she could not hide behind poor fabric. The message was cruelly clear: she would stand exposed without the shield of insignificance. As she walked, she kept her eyes forward. She refused to look for friendly faces because she knew there would be none. She refused to search for the Alpha King's gaze because if she leaned on it, she would collapse the moment it was withdrawn. The seats assigned to her were near the front, close enough that the court could monitor her reactions. The placement was a trap. If she appeared too calm, they would call it arrogance. If she appeared too tense, they would call it guilt. She lowered herself into the chair with measured control, shoulders squared, hands resting still. Her heartbeat did not slow, but she trained her face not to reveal it. The feast began with the ritual of loyalty. Cups were raised, oaths were spoken. The Alpha King accepted them with the same restrained authority he had shown in war. He did not smile. He did not soften himself to soothe the hall. His composure forced the nobles to behave, if only because their fear of him was more reliable than their respect. As the courses progressed, the air thickened with anticipation. It was not the anticipation of music or indulgence. It was the anticipation of conflict. The council had promised spectacle, and the realm had arrived hungry for it. When the final course was served, an elder rose from the council benches. His robe shimmered with embroidered crests, each stitch a reminder that he represented houses older than the current throne. His voice carried easily, trained for public authority. He began politely, praising the Alpha King's strength, his victories, his stability. The compliments were the sweet coating that made the poison easier to swallow. Then he turned the hall's attention toward her. He spoke of tradition. He spoke of bloodlines as the backbone of peace. He spoke of the trial of worth and its impossible lack of verdict, framing it not as mystery but as danger. He spoke of the assassination attempt without naming it, calling it unrest and consequence, as if her existence naturally produced violence. He implied she was an omen, a fracture in the realm's order, and that allowing her to remain within the palace was a betrayal of the ancestors. One by one, other voices joined. A noblewoman suggested that the Alpha King's mercy decree had been a moment of weakness brought on by manipulation. A rival lord insisted that mercy had limits and that the realm's safety required decisive removal. Another elder spoke with false regret, saying the girl had suffered enough already and that exile would be compassionate, as if banishment to hostile territory was a gift. The accusations built into a chorus. Each claim was designed to corner the Alpha King into one of two outcomes. If he condemned her, the court would claim tradition had triumphed and the throne had been corrected. If he refused, they would claim he was compromised, and the rebellion they had been quietly preparing would have its justification. She sat in the center of it, the hall's tension pressing into her ribs. She could feel eyes on her from every angle. Some looked hateful, some looked curious, some looked almost delighted, as if watching a creature tested for weakness. She felt the old instinct to shrink, to disappear, to make herself smaller so their attention might slide off her. She forced herself to remain upright. The Alpha King had told her survival was no longer her only role. Now she had to prove she had heard him. When the elder finished, he offered the demand in ceremonial language. Tradition dictated that an unverified participant of the conclave, especially one connected to destabilizing power, must be removed from proximity to the throne until a verdict could be reached. Removed could mean exile. Removed could mean confinement. Removed could mean execution, depending on how the court framed threat. The hall waited for the Alpha King's response. He did not answer immediately. He let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until the noble's confidence wavered under the weight of uncertainty. Then he rose. The movement alone changed the room. The Alpha King standing was a reminder of the difference between performative authority and real authority. He stepped down from the dais in a controlled, unhurried way, his gaze sweeping across the assembled factions with quiet dominance. He spoke only once, and his voice was calm enough that it forced everyone to lean in. He stated that the realm was demanding a sacrifice in the name of stability, but stability built on scapegoats was not stability at all. He stated that the trial's lack of verdict did not prove corruption in her, but corruption in the court's certainty. He stated that those who feared her power were admitting, without meaning to, that their own authority was built on fragile ground. Some nobles began to protest, but his raised hand stopped them. He did not allow interruption. He did not allow the court to control the rhythm anymore. Then he did what no one expected. He turned toward her. For a fraction of a second, she did not move. Her body went cold with disbelief. She had prepared for condemnation. She had prepared for exile. She had even prepared for some quiet compromise where she would be hidden away. She had not prepared for the Alpha King to bring the entire realm's gaze directly onto the space between them. He approached her chair, and the hall became so silent she could hear the crackle of braziers and the faint clink of jewelry as nobles held their breath. She looked up at him, and for the first time in that room, she saw something in his expression that was not solely kingly restraint. It was decision. It was resolve sharpened into inevitability. He extended his hand. The gesture was simple. The consequences were not. Her throat tightened. She hesitated, not because she did not want safety, but because she understood what accepting his hand would mean. If she stood, she would no longer be a servant tolerated by the palace. She would become a symbol. She would become a threat. She would become a banner people would rally behind or tear down. Her instinct screamed that she was not ready. Yet something deeper than instinct answered. The power that had stirred in the trial, the truth in the forbidden records, the knowledge that running would not stop the hunt. She had lived her entire life reacting to other people's choices. This was the first time the choice was placed in front of her openly, witnessed by the realm itself. She placed her hand in his. The Alpha King closed his fingers around hers with steady control and guided her to her feet. The room shifted as if the floor had tilted. He did not keep her behind him. He brought her beside him, positioning her where every wolf could see she was not hidden. He held her hand up slightly, not as a romantic display, but as a declaration of status. He announced her as his chosen mate. Gasps broke through the hall like cracks in glass. Outrage fled instantly. Some nobles surged to their feet, faces twisted in disbelief. Others went pale, calculating consequences faster than breath. The council benches erupted into furious murmurs. Loyalists looked stunned, unsure whether to celebrate or panic. Rival houses exchanged sharp glances, already measuring how this declaration could be weaponized. The Alpha King continued without hesitation. He declared her his equal before the throne. He stated that any challenge to her right to stand beside him was a challenge to the crown itself. The words detonated through the hall, undoing the careful control the nobles had tried to maintain. In that moment, political collapse began. Alliances that had depended on predictable marriage contracts fractured. Houses that had been negotiating for royal favor realized their leverage had vanished. Elders who had clung to bloodline purity felt their worldview threatened at its foundation. Some pacts would interpret this as a radical shift toward new law. Others would interpret it as tyranny disguised as devotion. The realm's old structure, built on controlled lineage, suddenly faced a ruler willing to rewrite it publicly. She stood beside him, hand still held, and felt the weight of it crash over her like cold water. The hall's gaze was no longer contempt alone. It was fear, hunger, anger, and something else that unsettled her even more, expectation. They expected her to be a witch. They expected her to be a pawn. They expected her to prove their worst stories correct. The pressure of their assumptions tightened around her throat. She fought not to tremble. She fought not to pull her hand away and apologize for existing. The Alpha King's grip remained steady, anchoring her in the storm he had created. But inside her, panic surged. She did not know how to be a mate, much less an equal. She did not know how to carry a crown's shadow without being crushed. She did not know how to survive being seen. The council tried to reclaim control. An elder demanded the declaration be revoked. Another invoked the old laws, insisting a king could not bind himself to a bloodline marked by a sealing curse. Voices rose, overlapping, turning the feast into a courtroom. The hall's order unraveled fast enough that even the guards tensed, ready to intervene if the chaos tipped into open conflict. Then a chair scraped loudly against stone. A rival Alpha stood. He was tall, his presence sharpened by a reputation built on dominance and territorial ambition. His pack's crest glittered at his throat, and his gaze locked onto the Alpha King with open challenge. The hall quieted again, not because peace returned, but because everyone recognized the moment for what it was, an opportunity for power to change hands. The rival Alpha's voice carried across the room, calm and cutting. He stated that if the king's chosen mate was truly worthy to stand beside the throne, then the realm deserved proof, not proclamation. He framed it as tradition, as honor, as protection of law, but the hunger in his eyes revealed the truth. He saw the king's declaration as a crack he could pry open. Then he issued a blood challenge on the spot. The words hit the hall like a blade dropped onto stone. And as the Alpha King's posture shifted, and every wolf in the room leaned forward to see what would happen next, she realized the feast had never been about celebration at all. It had been the stage for a confrontation that would decide whether she lived as a symbol or died as one. By sunrise after the blood challenge, the coronation hall looked intact, but the realm behind it had splintered. Messengers rode hard from the capital carrying versions of the same story tailored to each pack's pride. Councils met in manor houses and border forts, weighing whether the Alpha King's declaration was renewal or rupture. Old allies demanded concessions for their silence. Neutral territories threatened secession unless the throne reaffirmed bloodline law. Even loyalists argued over strategy, fearing that hesitation would invite revolt. In public, everyone bowed. In private, everyone sharpened terms, not blades, preparing to trade allegiance like currency. Rumor itself became a weapon, and it moved faster than Ryder could. Within the palace, her new status did not grant safety so much as visibility. Servants who once ignored her now watched for mistakes that could be reported upward. Gifts arrived for the king that carried hidden insults meant for her, flattering notes that implied she was temporary. At meals, seating charts shifted daily, attempting to isolate her from stable allies. An herbal draught meant for calming nerves was swapped for something that would cloud her senses during protocol lessons. A tapestry cord snapped above a stairwell moments after she passed, leaving a warning without proof. Every incident felt deniable, which made it repeatable. She learned to read malice in politeness. The Alpha King responded the way he always had to siege pressure, by building structure. He ordered a daily regimen that looked like etiquette to outsiders and strategy to those who understood court war. She practiced walking the hall with her scent controlled, neither cowering nor provoking. She studied the map of houses, learning which families prized tradition, which prized profit, and which prized vengeance. He taught her how to let silence answer bait, how to offer a truth that revealed nothing, how to stand still until others exposed impatience. He did not soften his standards, but he watched for fatigue, adjusting without calling it mercy, so resolve remained intact. She began to anticipate traps before they closed. When a hostess arranged introductions meant to embarrass her, she redirected the conversation towards shared border concerns, forcing nobles to reveal their positions publicly. When a ledger went missing and suspicion hovered near her attendants, she produced a copy she had quietly made for her own study, restoring order and earning reluctant respect. She offered the council a practical suggestion on grain stores for winter patrols, framed as service rather than authority, and watched several elders adopt it as their own. Each small victory was quiet, but quiet victories stacked into presence. The court hated her, yet it started fearing her mind. As tension rose, the Alpha King stopped treating her as a protected liability and began treating her as a partner in risk. He asked what she sensed in a room before he gave his own read. He let her review messages from wavering territories, then compared her conclusions to his advisor's plans. In turn, she learned his burdens were not only political but personal, shaped by years of choosing losses he could live with. Their bond strengthened through shared vigilance. She alerted him to subtle shifts in council tone, and he ensured her confidence did not become recklessness. Neither spoke of affection, loyalty showed in preparation, and kept them breathing. The elder who had revealed the records returned with another fragment, smuggled from a sealed archive beneath the old chapel. It described the curse not as a chain but as a timed lock, designed to open only when the bloodline acknowledged itself openly. Hiding, the text warned, fed the seal, denial strengthened it. The Alpha King recognized the logic as both mystical and political. The realm sphere had been built to force silence, and silence had preserved the curse. For her, the implication was terrifying. To break it, she would have to accept her lineage in full view of enemies. It demanded standing beside the crown, refusing invisibility forever again. Outside the palace, the factions hardened. One territory withheld its annual levy, claiming the throne had violated ancestral contract. Another offered support only if the Alpha King annulled the mercy decree and promised a blood-pure union later. Anonymous pamphlets appeared in markets, warning that a cursed queen would starve the packs and invite enemy spirits. Within the walls, her quarters were searched under pretense of security, looking for evidence to manufacture. She learned to keep documents memorized, not stored. The Alpha King increased patrols without declaring martial rule, refusing to give rebels a headline. He also assigned her a attendant whose loyalty was proven by hardship, not by house name. Some nights she woke convinced she had dragged him toward ruin, and she sat in the dark counting the costs she could not repay. On those nights she remembered the years of being told she was less than nothing, and she felt the old urge to offer herself up as apology. But the next morning she returned to training, repeating posture, breath, and controlled scent until fear stopped dictating her movements. She began keeping a private list of allies made not by affection but by observation, noting who hesitated before condemning her. Survival, she realized, could be active, not merely endured. That shift made the court's games feel less final. As the conclave's deadline approached, the rival Alpha gathered signatures for a formal challenge, while border packs staged loyalty drills that looked like rehearsals for secession. The Alpha King prepared a countermove, a public address at dawn, followed by a summit that would force wavering houses to choose sides under witness. He instructed her to remain within the protected wing until the hall was secured. She agreed outwardly, yet something in the elder's fragment kept echoing. Acceptance could not be performed from hiding. If the curse required full acknowledgement, then she might need to step into danger before he could shield her again. The thought settled like iron inside her. That night the palace quieted under heavy watch, but quiet did not mean peace. Torches burned lower to preserve secrecy, and the corridors smelled of locked doors and unsent messages. She waited until her attendant's footsteps faded, then opened the small chest where she kept nothing valuable, only necessities. She left a folded note without accusation, stating she was choosing visibility on her own terms. Using the servant passages she had memorized as a child, she slipped past guard rotations timed for nobles, not for someone who knew the wall's forgotten breathing spaces. On the eve of war, her room was found empty. No alarm rang, only a growing dread. She did not flee the palace to be rescued. She fled to stop being a prisoner of other people's fears. The note she left behind was not a confession of weakness, but a refusal to keep living as a symbol that belonged to everyone except herself. If the curse could only be broken through acceptance, then she needed a place where acceptance did not require permission from the court. She needed silence deep enough to hear what had been sealed inside her for generations. She needed to face the truth of her bloodline without an audience waiting to twist the outcome. The servant passages delivered her beyond the inner wall before dawn, into the sleeping city that still believed the palace held its peace. She moved through back streets where lantern light was thin and guards were trained to watch for enemies, not for a woman who knew how to disappear. She did not take a horse. A horse drew notice. She walked until the stone streets gave way to frost-stiff grass, then into a stretch of old forest that the capital had never fully conquered. Here, the air smelled cleaner, less perfumed with dominance and politics. The silence had depth, and in that depth she could finally feel the pulse that had begun in the trial without it being drowned by judgment. She headed toward the one place the Elder's fragment had hinted at, a ruin older than the throne and absent from official maps, the Hollow Shrine. The shrine had once been a sanctuary for the rival bloodline before it was erased, a place where oaths were bound not to a crown but to memory. Most considered it a myth, a story told by border packs to frighten children into obeying. But myth had a way of surviving where records were burned. She followed the landscape the way she followed instinct, trusting the sense of being pulled towards something that already knew her name. By midday she reached the first marker, a half-buried stone carved with the same runes she had seen glow beneath her feet in the Hall of Verdicts. Snow had collected in the grooves, softening the edges, but the symbol remained clear. Her chest tightened. She was close. Beyond the marker, the trees thickened and the ground dipped into a shallow valley. In its center lay the shrine, not grand, not preserved, but stubbornly present, broken pillars, a collapsed roof, and a circular platform of black stone that looked untouched by time. The moment she stepped into the ruin, the air shifted. It was not a gust or a temperature change. It felt like the space recognized her and adjusted around her. The scent of the forest dulled, replaced by something faintly metallic, like rain about to fall. Her heartbeat quickened, and with it the sealed power inside her stirred, responding to the runes embedded in the stone beneath the snow. She stood at the edge of the platform and hesitated. She had no teacher here, no guard line, no alpha king to steady the world with his authority. She had chosen this, and the choice suddenly felt heavier than any chain the court could have placed on her. If she awakened what was sealed, she might confirm every fear the realm had ever whispered about her. She might become what they had tried to destroy. She might become uncontrollable. That fear was not abstract. It had the shape of a lifetime. It was the memory of being treated as dangerous for simply existing, the memory of being told that an Omega-born life was a flaw. It was the threat hidden in every polite insult, the message that power and worth were not hers to claim. Part of her still wanted to be harmless, because harmless meant permitted. But harmless also meant hunted. She climbed onto the platform and knelt in the center, where the runes formed a ring. The ritual was not written out for her. It lived in her blood and in the shrine's response. She placed her palms on the stone and let herself breathe until her mind quieted enough to notice what had always been there. The seal was not empty. It was layered, like a lock built from shame, fear, and denial. It had been fed by every moment she had believed she was unworthy. She closed her eyes and did the one thing she had never been allowed to do. She acknowledged her own name without apology. She acknowledged her bloodline without shrinking. She did not know the names of her ancestors, but she recognized their presence like distant thunder, old memory pressing close. The stone beneath her hands warmed, then pulsed. The runes brightened softly, not erupting like the trial had, but responding with patient steadiness. Her breath caught when the first wave of ancestral memory hit. It was not a vision like a storybook. It was sensation layered on sensation, the feeling of running through ancient forest under moonlight with a pack that moved as one, the smell of smoke from a sacred fire, the weight of a crown refused rather than taken. She felt grief that was not hers alone, the sorrow of a line that had been forced into silence, the rage of being erased. She tasted the fear that had driven the curse's creators, and she understood something sharp and bitter. The realm had not sealed this bloodline because it was weak. They had sealed it because it was too strong to control. The power rose again, tightening around her ribs, testing whether she would resist it. She almost did. Instinct screamed that too much power meant losing herself. She had seen dominant wolves become monsters when they believed strength excused cruelty. She had watched nobles use authority like permission to break others. She did not want to become that kind of ruler, feared and empty. So she did not reach for dominance. She reached for balance. She let the power move through her without gripping it like a weapon. She treated it like breath, like tide, like something that could be guided by intention. She remembered every humiliation she had survived and refused to let it become revenge. She remembered the Alpha King's steady hand and refused to let his sacrifice become her excuse to crumble. She accepted that fear would remain, but she stopped letting it decide for her. The seal resisted once, flaring sharp under her skin as if warning her away. Her vision went white for a heartbeat. The air around the shrine snapped with pressure. Snow lifted from the platform in a slow swirl, as if gravity had loosened its hold. She nearly lost her breath. But she stayed kneeling. She stayed present. She repeated the truth inside her until it stopped shaking. I am not a mistake. I am not a curse. I am not unworthy. The runes dimmed, then settled into a steady glow that matched her heartbeat. The pressure in her chest changed, no longer constricting but expanding, as if a locked door had finally opened. Warmth spread through her limbs, not frantic, not uncontrolled. It felt like waking up after a lifetime of sleep. When she opened her eyes, the world looked sharper. Not brighter, but clearer. The forest's edges defined themselves. The shrine's broken pillars seemed less like ruins and more like witnesses. She could sense her own presence the way an alpha sensed territory, not as domination but as certainty. For the first time, she understood that authority did not need cruelty. Authority could be steadiness, the ability to hold space without collapsing or lashing out. She rose from the platform and realized her posture had changed. Not forced, not practiced, but natural. The shame that had lived in her shoulders no longer pulled them inward. Her scent shifted too, still carrying Omega-born softness, but threaded now with something ancient and undeniable. It was not the scent of submission. It was the scent of legitimacy. Far away in the capital, the Alpha King felt the change like a sudden pressure in the air. He had been moving pieces into place for the summit, preparing for a confrontation that could fracture the realm, when something unseen tightened and then steadied. It was not a messenger, not a report. It was instinct, the kind that had kept him alive. The bond he had declared publicly did not pull with panic. It pulled with clarity. He knew, without being told, that she had awakened something that could not be hidden again. He ordered preparations without explanation. He tightened palace security, not to trap her, but to brace for the shock of her return. He instructed his closest guard to secure the throne room's runes and the old wards beneath the dais. His advisors protested, confused, but he did not soften his command. The realm was shifting under their feet, and he would not be caught reacting late. In the territories beyond the city, the unrest sharpened. Border packs heard rumors of movement and tightened their lines. Rebel houses interpreted the king's sudden readiness as proof war was imminent. Loyalists sent urgent pleas for clarity. Everyone sensed that something had changed, yet no one could name it. In the palace itself, the throne room's ancient runes began to glow faintly for the first time in living memory. Not a flare, not a defensive surge, but a quiet recognition, as if the stone remembered an authority it had not felt in generations. The elders who noticed it went pale, and the most superstitious nobles crossed themselves with old gestures they pretended not to believe in. She was still days away from returning, still moving through forest and hidden paths, gathering herself into the new shape she had chosen. But the realm did not wait for her footsteps to announce her. Her power answered the throne before she did. The realm did not wait politely for her return. Open conflict began as it always did in the court, with language that pretended to be lawful. A coalition of old bloodline houses issued a formal declaration that the Alpha King's public choice had violated ancestral contract. They claimed the mercy law had been abused. They claimed the throne was compromised by a cursed influence. Then they did what factions always did when words were no longer enough. They withheld tribute, refused summons, and staged defensive gatherings of warriors at their borders. The capital responded with heightened patrols and tightened gates, and the streets filled with rumors so thick they felt like smoke. By the time she approached the city again, the atmosphere carried the unmistakable scent of a realm deciding whether it still wanted one king. Guards at the outer checkpoints were nervous, scanning tree lines and roads with the sharp attention of wolves expecting ambush. Citizens kept their heads down, as if eye contact itself could become accusation. Her passage through the outskirts did not remain secret for long. People sensed her before they saw her, drawn by the altered weight of her presence. Whispers moved ahead of her, not as mockery now, but as unsettled warning. At the palace gates, the guards stiffened, then stepped aside without being told. They did not smile. They did not cheer. They simply recognized authority in the air the way wolves recognized storms. Inside the walls, the corridors seemed narrower than she remembered, not because stone had changed, but because she had. The old fear did not vanish, but it no longer owned her movement. She walked through the palace as if she belonged there, not as a servant granted permission to exist. The Alpha King met her before she reached the throne room. He did not embrace her. He did not ask where she had been. Those questions belonged to a softer world than the one burning outside the doors. Instead he studied her face, her posture, the controlled steadiness in her breath. His gaze sharpened, not with suspicion, but with recognition. The bond he had declared publicly felt different now, no longer a protective vow stretched over a vulnerable person. It felt like alignment between two forces that could hold the realm in place. He spoke one sentence, quiet enough that only she heard it. He told her the throne room had awakened in response to her, and the council was close to fracturing completely. He told her the rival Alpha had gathered supporters in the capital's lower hall, demanding the blood challenge be honored publicly. The accusation was that the Alpha King had chosen an unworthy mate. The truth was that the rival Alpha wanted a spectacle that could legitimize rebellion. They entered the throne room together. The hall was already filled. Council benches held elders with faces tight and pale. Nobles clustered behind them like shadows. Loyalists stood near the throne, tense and watchful. Rival faction representatives occupied the opposite side, their postures rigid with confidence that had been practiced all night. The rival Alpha himself stood at the center, deliberately positioned beneath the tallest pillar so the room's architecture would frame him as an equal to the throne. The moment she stepped in beside the Alpha King, the room's noise collapsed. Every eye turned, and she felt the old scrutiny try to bite into her. This time it found fewer openings. Her scent did not waver. Her shoulders did not curve inward. She stood beside the throne not as a borrowed ornament, but as a presence the room had to account for. The rival Alpha's smile was sharp and thin. He addressed the king first, speaking as if he were offering respectful correction. He insisted the blood challenge was the realm's safeguard, a test to ensure the crown had not bound itself to weakness. He framed it as tradition, repeating the old phrases about purity and stability. Then his gaze shifted to her with calculated contempt. He accused her of being an unknown variable, a sealed danger, a threat wrapped in softness. The Alpha King did not rise to the bait. He could have ended it with brute authority, but brute authority would have fed the narrative that he was forcing the realm into submission. That was the rival Alpha's trap. He wanted the king to look like a tyrant so rebellion could look like justice. She understood the trap now, and she stepped forward before the Alpha King could speak. The movement alone sent a ripple through the room. It was not usual for a claimed mate, especially one the court despised, to take space in the center of power. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform dominance. She held the room with calm control, making the nobles lean toward her despite themselves. She told the rival Alpha that legitimacy was not measured by how loudly one demanded tradition. It was measured by whether one told the truth when truth threatened one's advantage. She reminded the hall that the trial of worth had been altered, not by her hand, but by the courts. She stated plainly that if the realm wanted stability, it needed to name the real corruption, the manipulation of sacred rites, the erasure of bloodlines, the sealing curse used as political weapon. Gasps moved through the benches. Some elders stiffened as if struck. Others looked away, suddenly interested in the stone floor. No one interrupted her because no one could deny the truth without exposing themselves. She did not stop there. She laid out the history as it had been hidden, piece by piece, not as vengeance but as evidence. She described the rival branch of the royal bloodline that had once existed legitimately. She described the records that had been burned and the crest scraped from statues. She spoke of the sealing curse placed not to protect the realm, but to protect a faction's grip on power. She made it clear that the cruelty the realm normalized, its obsession with purity, its contempt for the vulnerable, had been shaped deliberately to serve that old corruption. The rival Alpha tried to interrupt, claiming her words were lies crafted to excuse an unworthy rise. She answered him with restraint instead of anger. She invited the elder who had guarded the records to speak, and when the elder stepped forward with brittle pages and calm testimony, the room shifted again. Truth, in this hall, was more dangerous than any physical challenge. It forced every house to decide whether they were defenders of tradition or defenders of deception. The rival Alpha pivoted, demanding the blood challenge anyway, insisting that words could be twisted, but a challenge was sacred. The Alpha King's gaze narrowed, and the room expected him to accept or refuse. Either choice could fracture the realm. Acceptance risked turning the throne into spectacle. Refusal risked making the king appear afraid. She spoke again, and this time her voice carried a sharper edge, not of dominance, but of authority that had decided what it would not become. She said the realm's trials were meant to measure worth, not to entertain ambition. She said she would not spill blood to prove legitimacy to a man who benefited from chaos. She said if the rival Alpha wanted to test the throne, then the test should be governance, not violence. She proposed a public covenant, an immediate summit of territories where grievances would be spoken under oath, where records would be opened, where manipulations of the trial would be investigated, and where any house proven to have tampered with sacred rights would lose its council seat. It was a political blade, clean and precise. It cut the rival Alpha's options. If he refused, he would reveal he cared more about spectacle than stability. If he accepted, he would risk exposing his allies and his own strategies. The room held its breath. Then she did something that shifted the balance even more. She acknowledged her bloodline openly, not as apology, but as inheritance. She stated that the curse had delayed her awakening because the realm had demanded her silence, and she would be silent no longer. She stated that her authority would not be built on fear but on accountability. She promised reform without threatening revenge, a new balance without pretending the old world had not been cruel. Reluctant respect began in the places she least expected. A border pact representative, hardened by war and distrustful of nobles, watched her with careful interest. A few younger heirs, weary of elder corruption, exchanged glances that looked almost hopeful. Even some loyalists, who had been uncertain whether she was a risk, began to see her as a stabilizing force precisely because she refused to play the court's oldest games. The Alpha King stepped forward then, and the room tensed again, waiting for his command. Instead of taking back control, he did something the council had not anticipated. He acknowledged her leadership publicly. He stated that the realm needed more than a warrior king. It needed governance that could survive beyond battle. He declared that she would oversee the summit and the investigation into the trial's manipulation. He named her authority not as a gift, but as recognition. He made it clear that he was not protecting her because he was blinded by bond, but because the realm needed the truth she carried. That declaration forced the room into its real crisis. Old law demanded hierarchy remain untouched. New reality demanded corruption be faced. The nobles who thrived under the old system felt threatened. The Pax who had suffered under it felt a dangerous kind of hope. The realm stood at a crossroads where choosing one path meant abandoning the other. Even those who wanted to stay neutral realized neutrality was ending. Outside the palace, the city's unrest turned into organized demand. Crowds gathered near the outer gates, not with weapons, but with voices. They had heard too many versions of the story to stay silent. They wanted certainty. They wanted reassurance. They wanted someone to blame, someone to crown, someone to condemn. The palace guards reported that the people were calling for a public judgment, insisting the throne could not decide its own legitimacy behind closed doors. Inside the throne room, the council heard the same roar through distant stone. It rose and fell like a tide, growing louder as more citizens joined. The rival Alpha's smile returned, but this time it carried triumph. He spread his hands as if offering a reasonable conclusion. He said the people demanded a final decision, and the throne would either answer or fall to chaos. The Alpha King looked toward the great doors, then back at her, and the weight of the moment tightened around them both. The final judgment of the throne was no longer a council argument. It was being demanded by the people themselves. The public judgment did not arrive as a single verdict shouted into the streets. It arrived as a process the realm could no longer avoid. The Alpha King refused to meet the people's demand with force, because force would have proven the rebels' story true. Instead, he answered it with structure. He ordered the gates open to controlled entry, allowing representatives from the city's districts and surrounding packs into the outer hall where they could witness what would follow. He commanded the summit be held immediately, not in the shadows of private councils, but under oath before the realm itself. If legitimacy was being questioned, then legitimacy would be rebuilt in full view. The court resisted, but resistance weakened when the crowd's presence became impossible to ignore. Nobles who had relied on closed doors suddenly had to speak with witnesses watching their faces. Elders who had treated law like personal property had to explain it aloud. The rival Alpha attempted to frame the gathering as mob pressure, but his claim landed poorly against the reality of citizens standing silent, not riotous, simply refusing to leave until they were told the truth. The elder with the forbidden record stepped forward again, and this time he was not alone. 2 additional witnesses arrived from border monasteries and old pack archives, carrying fragments of the same hidden history. Each document confirmed the same pattern: a rival bloodline deliberately erased, a crest removed, a branch suppressed through a sealing curse designed not to kill power but to delay it until it could be made harmless. The assembled crowd did not react with elegance. They reacted with the raw shock of people learning their society's cruelty had been engineered. The council tried to salvage authority by declaring the past irrelevant. She answered them without raising her voice. She said the past was the foundation of every law they enforced in the present, and a foundation built on deception could not hold. She did not demand revenge. She demanded correction. Her restraint left the court with fewer tools. They could not label her a monster when she refused to act like one. The revised law emerged not from a single inspired speech but from hard negotiation forced into honesty by public witness. The Alpha King offered what the realm needed most, a path that did not require civil war. He proposed a formal restructuring of succession legitimacy, separating worthiness from bloodline purity. Blood could still matter as heritage, but it would no longer be the only door into authority. The realm would recognize that the throne's stability depended on capability, accountability, and consent, not on a closed lineage protected by fear. Her role in shaping the law became undeniable. She guided the language toward balance, ensuring the old houses were not stripped so violently that they would choose rebellion out of desperation, while also ensuring they could no longer hide corruption behind tradition. She demanded oversight for sacred rites like the trial of worth, requiring multiple neutral witnesses and penalties for manipulation. She insisted the mercy law be modernized, not as a loophole for monarchs, but as a protection against political scapegoating. Each clause, she argued for, carried the imprint of her own life, a refusal to allow the vulnerable to be crushed simply because it was convenient. The final vote was not unanimous. It never could be, but it was decisive enough to become law. Under that revised code, the realm formally recognized her as queen, not because the Alpha King had chosen her, but because the realm could no longer deny her legitimacy without denying its own truth. The announcement was made from the palace steps so the crowd could witness it, the words delivered in a tone that treated the moment not as romance but as history. When she stepped forward beside the Alpha King, she did not look like a servant elevated by luck. She looked like someone who had endured the realm's worst instincts and survived without becoming them. The people's reaction did not roar at first. It quieted, then shifted into something steadier, acceptance building from relief. They had wanted judgment. They were receiving direction. As the new law was sealed, the curse began to dissolve. It did not dissolve like a dramatic shattering. It dissolved like a knot untied slowly, tension releasing from places she had not known were clenched. In the days following the summit, she felt it in small moments, waking without the old weight of shame pressing down before thought, breathing without instinctively preparing for accusation, walking through corridors without waiting for punishment. The power inside her no longer surged unpredictably. It settled into her bones with calm permanence, as if it had finally found the shape it had been seeking all along. The elder explained it in simple terms. The curse had been designed to delay awakening until the bloodline could no longer be erased through silence. Its purpose had been fulfilled the moment she claimed herself openly and was recognized publicly. The seal could not hold against acceptance. It had never been meant to. It had been meant to enforce invisibility. Once invisibility broke, the curse lost its anchor. The realm's aftermath did not resemble a fairy tale. Healing was slower than victory. Houses that had threatened secession demanded concessions, and some were granted limited autonomy to prevent renewed war. Council seats shifted as investigations confirmed which elders had tampered with sacred rites. A few fled before consequences arrived, proving their guilt more loudly than any confession. Pacts that had long been marginalized gained new representation, and with representation came resentment from those who believed power was being stolen. The palace became a machine of rebuilding, drafting new codes, negotiating supply lines, reassigning patrols, reopening trade routes strained by unrest. In that work, she found her footing. Her leadership did not depend on dramatic dominance. It depended on clarity. She learned to listen to grievances without absorbing them as shame. She learned to make decisions without apologizing for their necessity. When nobles attempted to corner her with etiquette traps, she redirected them toward measurable outcomes, harvest reports, border security, trial oversight. When loyalists urged harsh punishments, she insisted on lawful consequence rather than vengeance. She became, to the surprise of many, the steadier half of the throne's public face, balancing the Alpha King's war-forged decisiveness with governance that could endure beyond crisis. Her relationship with him changed in the quiet spaces between council sessions, where the world's noise faded enough for honesty to exist. They did not perform affection for the court. They built partnership through shared responsibility. He consulted her before issuing decrees that would affect the territory's fragile peace. She trusted his instinct when threats surfaced that could not be negotiated away. Their devotion did not look like obsession. It looked like two rulers learning to stand without fear of being alone. There were moments she still felt the old doubt rise, especially when she heard whispers that she had been chosen only because the king wanted a symbol. In those moments, he did not comfort her with empty praise. He reminded her of facts. She had faced the court and refused to become cruel. She had rewritten law without burning the realm. She had claimed worthiness when everyone insisted she should beg for it. He treated her not as something he saved, but as someone who had saved the throne from the rot beneath it. The people slowly adjusted, because people always did. Children in the streets began repeating a different story, one less about cursed blood and more about a queen who had been named unworthy and stood anyway. Servants in the palace spoke her name with less fear and more pride, seeing in her rise proof that survival could become something larger than endurance. Even some nobles, those who understood change was inevitable, began aligning with the new balance, learning that power could be preserved without pretending the old lies were sacred. By the end of the season, the capital felt different. Not peaceful in the sense of perfect harmony, but stable in the sense of direction. The realm's identity had shifted from bloodline certainty to chosen legitimacy. The trial of worth was restructured, watched by neutral witnesses, its purpose reclaimed from political manipulation. The archives beneath the old chapel were reopened and copied, so truth could not be buried so easily again. On a quiet night, long after the crowds had dispersed and the council benches had emptied, she stood in the throne room alone for a moment, listening to the faint hum of runes in the stone. She realized the throne no longer felt like a place she was trespassing. It felt like responsibility she had earned. Her worthiness had not been granted by nobles. It had been claimed in the face of their refusal. The Alpha King entered and stood beside her without words. Their hands found each other naturally now, not as a public statement, but as an anchor. The bond between them had become something deeper than defiance. It had become a shared vow to keep the realm from sliding back into comfortable cruelty. Yet even in the quiet, the story did not close with certainty. Change always invited new tests. As revised law spread through territories, new leaders began rising, wolves who watched what had happened and understood that birth was no longer the final argument. Some would seek the throne for the right reasons. Others would seek it because the path had been opened. The realm had rewritten its crown, and with that rewriting came a new and unsettling promise. Future rulers would not be judged by lineage alone. They would be judged by what they chose to become. She did not claim the throne by blood, but by the courage to stand when the realm tried to break her. What began as rejection became the force that rewrote their laws and their future. The Alpha King did not save her, he chose her, and she chose herself. In a world ruled by fear, she proved worthiness is forged, not inherited. The crown remained, but the meaning of power changed forever. And the realm would never again mistake silence for weakness. If this story stirred something in you, let it travel beyond this moment. Stories like this deserve to be passed on. There's more unfolding here, more destinies waiting to be challenged, and you'll want to be here when the next one rises. Stay connected to this space where power, fate, and choice collide. This journey is only beginning. Because the next story may test everything you believe about worth and destiny. Before you go, where are you watching from right now, and which country is hearing this story with you?